So thank you, everyone, for inviting me here, especially Dr. Vogel and the organizing committee. This is my first time here at UOIT, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm not checking messages. I'm just turning on my stopwatch so I know if I'm on time or not. And I brought some juggling balls, so if things go really off the rails, I can just do a little juggling show. And here I'll do, just to get you on my side to start, I'll do a little trick. So just pour this. This chair's heavier than I thought it was going to be, actually. Now for something equally exciting, childhood obesity. So I've been told that you're good with think, pair, shares, that you like that sort of thing, so I thought I'd start off with one. So I know what I'm going to talk about today, but I thought I'd start off just by asking you, what interests all of you about childhood obesity? So I thought if you want to just take a second, I know a lot of you have pens and papers out, and just jot down something that interests you about childhood obesity, something that you might want to know about it, something that you've always wondered, something that you already know but find interesting. And just take, a few seconds to just jot that down on a piece of paper. And so then as soon as you got something jotted down, then if you want to just turn to your neighbor and share that with them, and vice versa. So we'll touch on most of those topics, at least a little bit, but please feel free throughout the talk if you want to interrupt me. If something's not clear, you have a question, just interrupt me. I don't want you to waiting 20 minutes with it burning in the back of your mind. So these are the things that I'm hoping you'll take away with you when you leave today. First of all, I hope that you'll be able to describe how we define childhood obesity. Because we talk about childhood obesity a lot, it's in the news quite a bit, but I'm not sure that everyone actually knows how we even define childhood obesity. And so I'd just like to get everyone on the same footing for starting off. Then I'd like to spend the next part of the presentation trying to help you be able to identify the key contributors to the childhood obesity epidemic. So I'm going to look at a range of about 10 or so, and I'm really going to focus on 4 key risk factors that really have strong evidence that they're contributing to the childhood obesity epidemic. And then finally, I hope after today, you'll be able to recognize ways to adopt or encourage a healthy lifestyle for a child, whether or not they're obese. Because most of the tips for healthy living are the same for a lean child as they are for an obese child. And so that's one of the things that we'll be talking about at the end. So to begin with, I thought I'd ask you again, how would you define childhood obesity? If if it was up to you to write a new definition for childhood obesity, what would you write? So anyone at all? How would you define it? Yes, back there.
It's more of an image. It's like when a little kid looks like with all due respect, a middle-aged guy that drinks a lot of beer.
So a kid with a beer gut. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? Anything? Would you define it based on body fat or on weight? BMI. Yes. All right. So actually, I'll jump to this slide then. So that's how we define it for the purposes of research. So when we're talking about the childhood obesity epidemic, we're talking about BMI. And for those of you who aren't familiar with BMI, it's your body mass index, which is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So that's how we determine obesity or overweight for adults. You just divide your height in kilograms by your height in meters squared. That gives you a number. And for children, it's a bit more complicated than adults because for children, their BMI changes as they age. So what we do is we use growth curves. So this is the international growth curve here. There's also an American growth curve because they have to have their own special curve. And then there's a World Health Organization curve that's also slightly different. But all these curves work in basically the same way. So you can see the first couple years of life, BMI sort of goes down naturally as a kid ages. Then it gradually goes up as they age. And so what we've done is we've constructed sort of the normal weight curve. And then they've constructed overweight and obese curves. So these curves here are the overweight and obese curves. So this first curve right here, this is the overweight curve. And so all we do to determine if a child is overweight is we just take their BMI, we plot it at their age on this graph, and if they fall above this line, they're considered overweight. It's as simple as that. If they're below this line, they're considered normal weight. That's all there is to it. It's simple to the point of being simplistic, probably overly so, but that's how it's done right now. And the way these curves were determined is that if you follow this growth curve, when you turn 18, you'll have a BMI of 25, which is considered overweight for an adult. This is the obese curve. And if you follow this curve, when you turn 18, you'll have a BMI of 30, which is considered obese for an adult. So same thing to determine if a child's obese. We just plot their BMI on the curve. If they fall up here, they're obese. That's simple. And I should mention that it's actually, you'd be surprised at what makes a child overweight. So we often have kids into our lab, and we often recruit overweight and obese kids specifically. And a child doesn't have to be very large to be considered overweight, because children have typically been, really pretty skinny. And so a child that we'd say, oh, they're a little chubby, is probably actually considered overweight or possibly even obese. So it's sort of, they're quite conservative, these curves. All right, so now I thought I'd just briefly touch on historical trends in overweight and obesity for Canadian youth. You've probably heard a lot of these in the news, so I won't really belabor them, but just again to get everyone on the same page. So this is data from the Canadian Health Measures Survey. So this is a very, very large survey that's representative of the Canadian population. And so what that means is that the average value for height and weight and age in this survey is very, very close to the average in the Canadian population as a whole. So we can sort of say if the value is X in the survey, it's probably that same value in the general population. And so what they did with this survey is they compared the height, weight, and body mass index of a kid in 1981 with a kid in 2009. And so this is for an average 12-year-old boy. And you can see that in terms of 1981 versus 2009, in 2009, the boy was actually about 2 inches taller, so significantly taller. That's a pretty big amount. But also 14 pounds heavier, so substantially heavier, and quite a bit more so than the gain in height. So as a result, there's also been a 1-unit increase in BMI, which is pretty substantial, and also an increase in hip circumference, so larger around the hips as well. So that's the average 12-year-old boy. This is the average 12-year-old girl, and it's much the same. So a 1-inch increase in height, but again, an 11-pound increase in weight, another quite large increase in body mass index, and also an increased waist circumference, so storing more fat around the midsection, which is even worse than body weight, is indicative of health risk. So really a negative change there that we're seeing. So that's the average value. Now this is the data for the percentage of the population that is considered overweight or obese for children and youth. So in 1981, it was quite low. It was about 15% for both boys and girls. By 2009, for boys, that's jumped up to about 30%. It's about 1 in 3 boys now at this point. And it's a little lower for girls. It's about 25%. So still, substantially higher than it was back in 1981. Yes, sir?
How do you explain the increase in height in that period? That's much faster than evolution would allow us to grow.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if it has something to do with, better nutrition, like less kids being undernourished and everyone sort of being above a certain threshold. I'm not sure, because they never really talk about that. But it is interesting. It is. Yeah, and so that's why it's interesting that even with that increase in height, kids are still heavier for a given height than they were. So they've gained more weight than they have height. But yeah, it is fascinating. If there's any dietitians in the crowd or people who really know growth and development, feel free to speak up. Yeah?
Because you have a certain genetically predetermined height.
Yeah.
And if you're overnourished earlier in life, you just grow that much more quickly.
Okay. Oh,
And
there you go.
there's a little leeway there too, So like if you're undernourished a bit, maybe you'll only grow to be 6'1".
Right.
If you're overnourished, maybe you'll be a little bit taller.
Okay.
It just kind of depends.
Okay, so there you go. Good question.
Do you know what we would see for 2012?
No, I know that they've got the data, but I haven't seen it published in the same way. So that's why I use this data, because they've published it in a slightly different way. I think, if anything, it seems to have sort of plateaued, at least over the short term. But it's definitely hasn't gone down at all. So this data now is similar, but this is showing just the percentage of kids who were abdominally obese. So kids who had a waist circumference that was large enough that they're considered to be at increased risk. And this is probably more important than body weight, if anything. So back in 1981, only about 3% of boys were considered abdominally obese. And now that's jumped up to almost 15% for boys now. For girls, it's gone from about 7% up to about 25%. So a big increase. And this, again, is, like I was saying, probably more important than weight. So kids aren't just heavier, but they're rounder. And more kids are moving into that range where we'd say that they may be at increased risk due to their body weight. So just briefly, I want to touch on sort of some obesity-related policies here in Ontario and Canada more generally. So in the past few years, we have a federal, provincial, territorial framework for action to promote healthy weight. So this started in 2010. I should mention that these policy slides I borrowed from my supervisor, Mark Tremblay, so I should give credit to him for those. So this FBT framework was called Curbing Childhood Obesity. It had 3 integrated strategies, making childhood overweight and obesity a collective priority, coordinating efforts on key policies, and measuring and reporting on collective progress. And the goal or the vision is to make Canada a place that creates and maintains the conditions for healthy weights. So I'm not sure if anything has come of this framework, but this is sort of the most recent information that I know on it, that we have a framework at least, which is a bit of a trend. So here we have the federal government started a dialogue on healthy weights for children, so stakeholders could be involved in this. So some of you may have been invited, so dietitians, exercise physiologists, obesity researchers, parents, kids, we're all invited to give their ideas on ways to promote healthy weights in Canada. Again, lots of discussion. I don't know that any actual action has come from it, but discussion. Then Ontario recently set up a panel to focus on childhood obesity that was co-chaired by the CEO of the hospital where I work at CHIO and also the CEO of Participation. They made a nice report with lots of nice recommendations, some actual pretty good ones. But again, there's just a report so far. I don't know that any actions come out of it. So as far as policy goes, there's a lot of dialogue, and sort of every 5 years or so, people make a committee and make some recommendations. But so far, no real actual policies coming out of that, at least as far as I know. All right, so now let's focus on some of the drivers of childhood obesity rates. I'm going to talk about, like I said, about 10 risk factors, but I'm going to really focus on 4 key ones. And I've sort of based my presentation today on a paper I did a few years ago looking at potential contributors to the childhood obesity epidemic. So I looked at the evidence linking each potential risk factor to childhood obesity in Canada. And to be considered a really strong candidate for being a risk factor for childhood obesity, there had to be 2 criteria. One is that the behavior had to have increased in recent decades. So as childhood obesity has increased, the behavior has to have increased to have been driving these obesity rates. And then the second criteria is that it must be clearly linked with childhood overweight or obesity. So if it meets these 2 criteria, there's a very good chance that it's contributing to the childhood obesity epidemic. If it fails one of these 2 criteria, then it's, at best, it's unclear whether it's contributing. So the factors I'm going to focus on today, I'm going to focus on 4 factors that have strong evidence linking them with the childhood obesity epidemic. So that's sugar-sweetened beverage intake, screen time, sleep, and parental obesity, which is sort of a strange one, but I'll get to that later. And then there are 6 or 7 factors that are plausible, but we don't have really strong evidence yet. So those are things like diet, physical activity, endocrine disrupting chemicals, things like that. So I'll touch briefly on those after. So I'm going to begin with sugar-sweetened beverage intake. So sugar-sweetened beverages are pop, energy drinks, things like Fruitopia, so anything that's sweetened with extra sugar. And so this is data from the US, but I think it's safe to assume it's fairly similar to Canada. So in 1977, the average American kid consumed about a third of a can a day, so about 150 milliliters a day, so somewhere between a third and a half a can of pop a day. When you compare that to 1998, it's jumped up to a little over a can. So it's more than doubled the amount of pop that kids are consuming on a daily basis. So a pretty substantial increase. And it seems like it's continued to go up since then. And so and this is just pops. This isn't considering Sunny D or energy drinks or other things. And now, unfortunately, sugar-sweetened beverage intake is very closely related with excess weight gain in children and youth. So there was a paper in The Lancet a few years ago, and they looked at weight gain over a 1.5-year period in 10-year-old children. And what they found was that each daily serving of pop was associated with a 0.2 increase in BMI over that 1.5-year period, and that's equivalent to about a pound for an average height 12-year-old. So an extra pound per serving of pop. So that's fairly substantial when you think of a 12-year-old over a 1.5-year period. If you're doing that throughout your childhood, that's going to add up quite quickly if you're having a couple servings of pop a day. Now, this is data from a meta-analysis, so they combined all the research that was available on pop intake and health. And what they found was that there was a clear association between soft drink intake, energy intake, and body weight. So sort of what you'd expect. I mean, it's pretty reasonable. And then finally, another similar systematic review found the same relationship and concluded that there's also sufficient evidence for public health strategies to discourage consumption of sugary drinks. So really, as far as dietary factors go, or obesogenic factors in general, sugar-sweetened beverage intake is a really strong one that it seems pretty clearly linked with childhood overweight and obesity. So yeah, increased sugar sweetened beverages tends to mean increased weight gain. And there seem to be three very simple reasons why this is the case, and they're fairly intuitive. One is that pop and other drinks are very energy dense. So they've got a lot of calories in a can of pop. You can consume it very, very quickly. So if you were going to consume an equal amount of calories in a sandwich, it would take you a lot more time and require a lot more effort. They're also not very filling. So a can of pop doesn't really fill you up at all. So it's very easy to overconsume then if you're drinking pop, because you're not going to be filled up and eat less later on. Compared to if you ate an apple, you're probably going to be full and eat a bit less later on. And then finally, they may also cause some sort of insulin spike and crash. So there are a lot of people talking now about carbohydrates really being a bad factor, especially bad for weight, and they cause an insulin spike, and then you get your blood sugar rush, and then your blood sugar drops, and then you don't feel like exercising, and you get hungry again. So there may be other factors, even separate from just the calories there. So that's the evidence for pop. So just by a show of hands there, how many people would say that, generally speaking, pop is probably bad for kids? Okay, so most people, okay. So then, just for the sake of being provocative, how many people would say juice is bad for kids? I'm surprised. Excellent, okay. Because normally people disagree with me on that. So is there anyone who doesn't say juice is bad for kids? Anyone wants to be the brave person to dissent? Yes, all right.
It's not as simple as asking to juice, because too much juice, some juices are not, do not have added sugar, so you have to quantify what kind of juice we're talking about before you can actually have.
So we were saying,
And I'm a nutritionist, so
right. So for the sake of argument, then say a glass of orange juice.
glass of orange juice?
Yeah.
If it's like fresh squeezed with no sugar added, it's an excellent source of vitamin C, so within the amounts you should take, most people, my son, he goes into the kitchen, he gets one of his big
Right.
glasses with a handle on it and pours the entire thing.
Yes.
And he's stopped drinking pop, but he drinks juice now. He says, I only drink one glass a day, but his one glass is probably 3 servings.
Right.
I would say don't substitute your pop with juice to that level.
Yes.
To the correct amount of juice, and then it's a good question.
Yeah, so that absolutely makes sense. And yeah, when I was in high school, I literally drank over a liter of juice a day. And my answer was always, it's juice. But so then this is sort of preaching to the choir then, but I like this slide. So I mean, any of you who know, do any of you know who Yoni Friedhoff is in Ottawa? Yes, so some of you do. So he's an obesity, or a bariatric physician in Ottawa, and he has a well-read website. But as he likes to argue, that a glass of juice, a large glass of juice, is essentially equivalent to a glass of Coke with a multivitamin dissolved in it, in terms of nutritional content. And so I think your point's well taken, that if you're drinking the actual recommended amount of juice, it's fine, but if you're drinking the amount that people typically consume, or if you just simply substitute pop for juice, then it could be problematic. So looking at the second driver of obesity. So this one I'm going to focus on a bit more, partly because it's my own bias. I'm a sedentary behavior researcher. So sedentary time, when we talk about sedentary time, we're talking about not like the lack of physical activity. We're talking about actually sitting too much. So we're talking about behaviors like watching TV, playing video games, driving in a car, any behavior that you're sitting down and burning very few calories. So all of you right now are sedentary. I'm not, but you are. And unfortunately, it seems to be increasing quite dramatically in recent decades. So this is American data on media use. So they asked kids to report how much media use they did back in 1960 and then more recently. And so the media included listening to the radio, reading newspapers and books, watching TV. So it was very broad, but all sedentary behaviors. So in 1960, the average kid had about 37 hours a week of media exposure. In the year 2000, that had jumped up to over 50 hours a week. So 2 hours more a day in that 40-year period. It gets much worse, though, when we look at 2010. It's now over 70 hours a week. It's about 75 hours a week. Now, this is self-reported, so it's not, you have to take this data with a bit of a grain of salt. And this doesn't take into account multitasking. So let's say I was using my computer while also being on my phone while also using the TV. If I spent 2 hours using all three simultaneously, this would actually count that as 6 hours. But even when you take into account multitasking and just take total time being in front of a screen, it's still substantially higher than it used to be. It's about 55 hours a week now spent in front of at least one screen. And so Canadian data is very similar to American data. So the average Canadian kid spends about 6 hours a day on weekdays and about 7 hours a day on weekend days. And this data comes from the the Active Healthy Kids report card on physical activity from a couple years ago. So kids spend a lot of time engaging in sedentary behaviors. And I should mention, even school is very sedentary. About 50 to 70% of gym class is actually spent being sedentary when you measure it objectively, because kids are standing, they're sitting, they're not moving that much. So kids are very sedentary. And unfortunately, given how popular it is, it's also very bad for kids. So we did a meta-analysis a couple years ago in our lab, and we found 232 studies that looked at sedentary time and health outcomes in kids. So we had almost 1 million participants across all these studies. And these are our conclusions. And it was that watching TV for more than 2 hours a day was associated with unfavorable body composition, so more likely to be overweight or obese, more likely to have increased body fat. It was associated with decreased physical fitness, lower self-esteem, worse pro-social behavior, and decreased academic achievement. So basically, you name it, if it's a bad health outcome, it's associated with screen time in kids. And it's a very consistent association, sort of depressingly so. As a result of that systematic review, we now in Canada have evidence-based sedentary behavior guidelines. So you can find these at csep.ca/guidelines if anyone's interested in this. So kids, we now suggest in Canada they should get less than 2 hours a day, but less is better. So 2 hours a day is the upper limit, but if they do no screen time, that's all the better. And they have sort of suggestions for ways to avoid sedentary time. So don't drive to school, walk to school. Don't sit in front of the TV playing video games after school, kick the kids outside. In the evening, again, kick the kids outside again. So really trying to limit that time spent in front of a screen. And so you'd think, based on this evidence, or I would have assumed that, okay, kids are sitting in front of TVs more, they're not burning many calories. And there's some evidence for that, but it actually turns out that most of the evidence suggests that the more time kids spend in front of screens, the more they eat. So it's actually the eating that's driving this relationship, not the lack of physical activity. And so this is data from my colleague Jean-Philippe Chaput in Ottawa. And so he had high school students come into the lab on 2 separate occasions. One day they sat down and just read quietly for an hour. And one day they sat down and played video games for an hour. And at the end of each session, they were given an all-you-can-eat buffet. So a pretty fun study if you're a high school kid. And so here's the energy intake in those 2 sessions. So you can see substantially higher after playing video games compared to the control session. And I know it's in kilojoules, which is unintuitive for most of us. So it was actually about 163 calorie difference that they overconsumed following playing video games compared to just reading quietly. So you can imagine that's 1 hour of video game. So if you're doing that before every meal, if this effect holds up, that's pretty substantial. And from other research we've done, it seems like the video games have an especially strong relationship with health in boys, more so than girls. Probably because boys play a lot more, but it seems especially important in teenage boys. We also know that food ads very reliably increase food intake in kids. Again, depressingly so. So this is a study where they had a bunch of 7-year-old kids come into the lab. They watched a cartoon. It was a 15-minute cartoon, and the cartoon either had food advertisements or no food advertisements, just advertisements for other things than food. And during that time, they had a big bowl of Pepperidge Farm goldfish crackers in front of them, and they measured how many crackers they ate during the 2 conditions. So during the day without food ads, they consumed about 19 grams on average of crackers. On the condition with food ads, which was identical, same cartoon, just different ads, they ate an average of 27 grams of goldfish crackers, which is a difference of 45%. So a substantial increase. And this isn't the only study that's found this. This is consistent across studies and seems to be a bigger effect in children who are already overweight or obese. So there are certain kids who are susceptible to this at a very high level. And just to point out that there's actually a website called goldfishfun.com set up by Pepperidge Farms made specifically to advertise to children where they have tons of videos and fun games. So this is something that's very prevalent. If you've ever watched Saturday morning cartoons, there's lots of food ads. So very plausible that this could be increasing the weight of kids. The good news is that if we reduce sedentary time, it also seems to reduce body weight pretty consistently in overweight or obese kids, which is impressive since not much seems to reduce body weight. So in the same systematic review that we did, we looked at all the interventions that have forced kids to cut their screen time, and we found that there was an overall decrease in mean BMI, so a consistent reduction in body weight when these kids cut their screen time. So here's an example of one of those studies. This study took overweight and obese 10-year-old boys, and they had them either continue watching screen time at their normal level, or they had them cut it in half. So they were cutting it by a little over 15 hours a week. And they maintained this for 2 years. I should mention they did that because they put a device on their TV so that they couldn't actually use it more than a certain number of hours a day. So, so I recommend that if you're trying to cut your kids' screen time. So they maintained this reduction for 2 years. And then this shows their body weight over time. And so there was a bit of a reduction in both groups, which is not uncommon, but a much larger reduction in the intervention group. And what's fascinating and impressive is that this was maintained over a 2-year period. And you hardly ever see that in an obesity intervention, to see body weight come down and keep coming down for a 2-year period. So a very impressive finding, and like I said, fairly consistent. What's most interesting is that this seems to be due to changes in food intake. So we have food intake here on the y-axis, and you can see in the intervention group, food intake came down even though they weren't telling the kids to eat less. They just said, you can't watch as much TV, and they naturally began to eat less. And also interesting is that there was no change in physical activity levels. So they didn't go and exercise more when they stopped watching TV. They just ate less. So if you're trying to promote health in kids and reduce body weight, this is a very good way to do it, I would suggest, based on the evidence. So looking at the next factor that's sort of related to screen time is reduced sleep. So sleep duration, unfortunately, seems to have decreased in recent decade, which is probably no surprise to anyone. So between 1974 and 86, the average sleep time of 2-year-olds decreased by about 45 minutes a night, which is pretty substantial when you think of a toddler. And it seems like the issue is that kids get up at the same time they always did, but they now go to bed later. And that may be partially due to increased screen time. So at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, where I work, we have a sleep lab, and I was speaking with the staff there, and they said the kids come in because their parents say they're not sleeping well, so they bring them into the lab, they spend a night there, and more than once a parent has given their child an iPod, an iPad, or something to help them fall asleep. And so some of these kids don't have sleep problems, they're just being kept up by screen-based devices. And I just read a survey last night that the number 2 most common reason why parents put a TV in their children's bedroom is to help them fall asleep. And not surprisingly, that doesn't work. It does the opposite. It keeps them up. So don't put a TV in your kid's bedroom. But I think it's very strongly linked with screen time. And unfortunately, as this meta-analysis shows, the less sleep kids have, the more likely they are to gain weight. So this large-scale meta-analysis found that kids who sleep less than 10 hours a night are at almost double the risk of obesity than those who slept more than 10 hours a night. So again, pretty substantial effect there. And it's been estimated using the same data that 5 to 13% of childhood obesity may be directly due to lack of sleep. And the reason the lack of sleep probably has these effects is that kids, or adults, anyone, when they're not getting enough sleep, it increases hormones that make you hungry. It makes you less likely to be physically active. When you're awake more hours, you have more time to eat. So you have more time to be exposed to other things in the environment that might promote weight gain. So really, sleep across the board is better to have more of it than less when you're a child, especially. Just want to point out that because of these contrasting findings, that screen time is so bad and that sleep time is so good, my colleague JP and I recently wrote an editorial arguing that if we want to promote childhood obesity, we should really get kids to turn off the TV and have a nap. And that if we replace that TV time with the nap, at least theoretically, we might actually help prevent weight gain. So the final sort of key driver of the obesity epidemic is increased obesity among adults and parents. And I know this one's sort of not counterintuitive, but a bit strange since we can't really target it as easily, but it seems to be a very important driver of the childhood obesity epidemic. So really one of the biggest risk factors for childhood obesity is whether or not their parents are obese. So this is from a large cohort study in the UK, and they found that having a father with obesity increased the risk of being obese at age 7 by about 2.5 times. So big effect for having an obese father. Having a mother with obesity increased your risk of obesity by about 4 times. And having both parents with obesity increased your risk by 10 times. So these are huge effect sizes. And again, this was a study of, I believe it was 8,000 students from baseline to 7 years. So like a big, high-quality study and very strong effects. And there are some really obvious and solid mechanisms explaining this. So first off, is that body weight is largely genetically determined. So if your parents are susceptible to obesity, there's a very good chance you will be too, because you'll probably have similar genes, especially if both parents have those genes. Also shared behaviors. So if your parents engage in a lot of behaviors that are going to promote weight gain in themselves, you're probably going to engage in those similar behaviors in the home environment. And finally, the last one that's sort of emerging is the intrauterine environment. So my lab mate Zach Ferraro has done a lot of work on this. And it seems like factors that children are exposed to while in the womb actually can have a very large impact on their health down the road. So a really fascinating study that looked at this, they took mothers who had had weight loss surgery. So they had iliopancreatic diversion, and that's what this shows. But just basically they rearranged their stomach and intestines to make it harder to eat. So it's a very common weight loss surgery. And these women had at least one child before and at least one child after the surgery, and they compared the body weights of the kids before and after. So these are the body weight distributions of the kids born before their mothers had surgery. So you can see that very few are underweight, about a third were normal weight, about 20% were overweight, and about 40% were obese. So a very high proportion were overweight or obese, way higher than in the general population. Now when we look after they had surgery, so same mothers, different baby, just after they had the surgery and lost a significant amount of weight, you can see the amount who are underweight is still pretty low, a little higher but still low. The amount who are normal weight, much, much higher. The number who were obese is similar, but overweight similar. The number who were obese is basically cut in half. So again, these are the same families, same mothers. The only major difference is they've undergone this weight loss. And again, a very substantial effect. And it's sort of driving home that factors that are involved in the circulation, so whether it's insulin or glucose or some other epigenetic factor, seems to promote having a larger baby and weight loss or weight gain down the road. So if you can lose weight before pregnancy, then it likely will reduce your child's risk of being overweight or obese. And I should mention, even if you just engage in healthier behaviors while you're pregnant, it should still also reduce the risk, even if you're not reducing body weight. So then there are a bunch of other factors that I haven't really talked about yet that may or may not be linked with the childhood obesity epidemic. They may be a factor for individual children. They may be, it may vary, but there's not as strong evidence as for those first four, where we really have solid evidence. And two things that I really haven't focused on much at all yet are physical activity and diet. And the reason is that although there's very plausible links for these to be linked with childhood overweight and obesity, it's really hard to tell if these have increased over time, because it's largely based on self-report data, and kids tend to be biased because they know that they're supposed to say certain things for their diet. They know they're supposed to say certain things for physical activity. So we do know kids with obesity tend to be less physically active, but we also know that since kids who are obese weigh more, they burn about the same number of calories overall once you account for that extra weight. So there is a relationship there, but it's not terribly strong. And it's actually quite a bit smaller than you might assume, the relationship between physical activity and weight gain in children. And there's also some questions about what's causing what. So are kids who are obese, are they becoming obese because they're not active enough, or are they not active enough because they're obese and that restricts their opportunities for physical activity? And it's actually not clear. And it's hard to know if physical activity levels have changed over time. If you look at the large surveys, it actually suggests that physical activity has gone up over time. But of course, there's bias, and it's just hard to get kids to accurately quantify how active they are. So it's hard to know if that's true or not. With diet, looking at factors other than POP intake, so fat intake is one that people often jump to. But again, there's very equivocal evidence for fat intake in childhood obesity. So some studies say it's very important, some say it's not important at all. So it's tough to say with clarity, at least in my opinion. It's also very difficult to track trends in total energy intake over time, because again, kids are, they know that they shouldn't be reporting tons of candy intake and tons of sugar and fat and all these things. So it may bias their responses in sugar or in surveys. And I just would point out that there is lots of evidence that physical activity and diet are very important for health. This is just whether or not they're important for the childhood obesity epidemic specifically. But they're super important for health. We still need to promote these just specific to the obesity epidemic. So now some other plausible contributors or causes of childhood obesity. So it was mentioned before, hormones and other things that are related, like endocrine disrupting chemicals. So endocrine disrupting chemicals are chemicals that are in the environment that may have some sort of effect on our hormones. So they're persistent organic pollutants. There are hormones in our food supply. There are hormones in our drinking water. So if someone's on birth control, that goes into the water supply, and that's not actually taken out through the purification, so that is in the water supply. So there are lots of sources of hormones and chemicals that act as hormones in our food, our water, and in our environment, and a lot of those have been linked with weight gain, at least in animals. So it's very plausible that these could be pushing up body weights, but there's not a lot of evidence yet, but it's certainly plausible these could be contributing. Another one is the built environment. So this is describing how we structure our communities, whether you have sidewalks and street connectivity and parks, and whether your community is safe, and all, whether there's streetlights, all these things about our environment. And over the past 30, 40 years, our environment has changed. We've become much less walkable, more suburban, where there's big streets, no sidewalks. Kids, like was mentioned before, they're less likely to go walking and playing on their own. So there have been changes in the built environment that probably have reduced physical activity. But then there isn't conclusive evidence that this change in the built environment has caused changes in obesity. So the evidence there is sort of wishy-washy. So it probably is important for physical activity, maybe not for obesity specifically. Also motor skills. So I know Megan and Emily are doing work on this. So the idea being that if a child doesn't have motor skills, they can't be physically active, therefore they're more likely to be overweight or obese. And again, there is evidence that it seems to be linked with reduced physical activity. If you don't have motor skills, you're going to be less active because you can't partake in some things. Less clear if that actually predisposes to obesity, but it's certainly plausible. Also, one that's starting to get more attention is changes in gut flora. So the bacteria in your stomach and intestines actually influence how you metabolize food. And it's been found that people who are overweight or obese have different bacteria in their gut than people who are lean. And it actually, there's more and more evidence now that the bacteria are playing a role. That your bacteria doesn't change when you become obese, but you become obese because there's a change in your bacteria. So some people have actually suggested poop transplants as a way to change your bacteria in your gut to help prevent or lose weight. So another one that's plausible, but not a whole lot of evidence yet. Another sort of non-traditional one is central heating and air conditioning. And I like your face when I did that one. So the reason is that it actually takes your body quite a bit of energy to regulate your temperature. So if it's really cold outside, it requires energy to keep warm. If it's hot out, it requires energy to get rid of that heat. So when you're in a nice air-conditioned room on a hot day like today, you're burning way less calories than you would have 40 years ago when it was really hot in here. And so, again, it's plausible. Not a lot of strong evidence, but it makes sense that it could be having an impact. And there are also brown adipocytes that burn more energy when you get cold. So some like weight loss fads are to go and jump in a really cold pool of water or run outside in your underwear when it's like minus 20, and it'll stimulate these brown adipocytes and you'll burn more energy. Seriously, people are promoting this, but it's plausible at least that this is having an impact. Another big one that definitely has an impact in specific children is the side effects from medication. So a lot of psychiatric drugs especially cause massive weight gain in kids, like just massive weight gain. So Val Taylor, I believe she's at McMaster, talked a lot about this, that it's frightening how quickly these kids gain weight when they're on these drugs. And so especially because weight, once it's there, it's really hard to bring someone back from obesity to normal weight. So very big impact in certain specific kids. And then the last one, like I mentioned before, so increasing maternal age has been linked, at least in animals, to increase propensity to gain weight. Not sure if it has an impact in humans, but it's been suggested as something that's plausible. So, and even though we don't know for certain whether any individual factor is a real smoking gun, we do know that as a whole, these are all predisposing towards more weight gain rather than less weight gain. So as a whole, we know our environment is more obesogenic than it was 30, 40 years ago, even if we don't know what specific trigger is causing that. And it may differ for certain people. And finally, I just wanted to point out that even feral animals are gaining weight. So a really fascinating paper from a couple years ago, the Proceedings of the Royal Society, they looked at 17 different populations of animals. They looked at lab animals, domesticated animals, feral animals, and in every single population they looked at, they have gained weight. So their midlife body weight had increased in every single population, which is fascinating, especially because a lot of people say it's only, it's just those little, gluttonous kids and it's all their fault, and I think this suggests that maybe it's not. There's at least something in the environment that's promoting increased weight gain. So just to diagrammatically show it, raccoons now are substantially larger than they were before. Yes.
One of the things I wondered, Travis, they talk about pharmaceuticals getting dumped into our water system.
Right.
Pearl brought up the issue of any
Mm-hmm.
hormones in animals. You wonder if there's
Oh, absolutely.
something in our water system.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's certainly plausible. And the other one I didn't mention, there's also antibiotics in our foods as well that could be changing that gut flora. Yeah, so there's lots of stuff. Yeah, it's stuff that you might not consider, but it's hard to really tell what's causing these changes. But I love this paper, and anyone who's curious, I can share the reference because it's a very cool paper. So sort of the last section, I thought I'd focus on health more than body weight. So I just wanted to ask a question, sort of another voting question. Are sumo wrestlers healthy? So who here would say that sumo wrestlers are healthy by a show of hands? Okay, so Megan sort of, okay, Millie a little bit. Okay, some wishy-washy. And this is when they're active, when they're competing, just to be specific. Okay, oh, we got one more maybe. Okay, so who would say that you would guess they're unhealthy by a show of hands? All right, okay, more people. Okay, cool, and some people abstaining, that's fine. So actually, it turns out that sumo wrestlers are actually, when they're competing, very healthy. And the reason is because they're crazy physically active. And so this is sort of the important message one message I really want you to take away from this is that regardless of body weight, lifestyle matters. And if someone has a healthy lifestyle, then it doesn't really matter what their body weight is, or it matters a lot less. So people tend to assume that body weight determines health, and it's been overplayed, I think, the role of body weight specifically. Lifestyle matters more than body weight. I should mention, once sumo wrestlers are no longer competitive and stop exercising, then their health goes downhill because their obesity has more of an impact then. But if you're active, then you're likely to be metabolically healthy obese, and that's a good place to be if you're obese. So this is from a paper in Diabetes Care from a few years ago, looking at the relative impact of body weight versus exercise. And what they concluded was that many of the beneficial health effects of physical activity are independent from its effects on adiposity. So in other words, even if physical activity is not reducing your body weight, it's still good for you. And I don't think enough people know that or realize that. And conversely, bad health behaviors are bad even if you're skinny. So this is a study that looked at 17,000 Canadians over 12 years, and they looked at how much time they spent sitting on a daily basis and their risk of death over that 17-year period. So these are the people who sat the least. They had the lowest risk of death, followed by people who sat about 50% of the time, had an 11% increased risk of death. People who sat 75% of the time had a 36% increased risk of death, and those who sat pretty much all the time had a 54% increased risk of death. And what's interesting is that this was independent of body mass index, of smoking, of other behaviors. So whether or not you're skinny or overweight doesn't matter so much if you have these bad behaviors. It's really important to focus on the behaviors rather than getting too caught up on your body weight. The other thing is that the body mass index, which is what we use to identify either adults or children as obese, it's not perfect. So this is a recent paper that came out in JAMA that got a lot of attention. And what they found was that the lowest risk of death is actually in people who are overweight. People who are normal weight or obese have the same risk of death, and the risk of death only really increases when you get to people who are very, very obese, so class 2 or class 3 obesity. So interesting and important finding that really whether you're normal weight or mildly obese, your risk for death is about the same. So suggests we shouldn't be really so focused on body weight. And the reasons why we shouldn't focus so much on body weight, and these will probably be pretty familiar to a lot of you, is one is that it measures weight and not fat. So Shaq is the classic example of someone who was, I think his BMI is like 37 or something when he was competing. So he was well into the obese range, but he was a world-class athlete and didn't necessarily have that high of a body fat percentage. He was just heavy. More importantly, BMI completely ignores body fat distribution. And so I did a lot of work on this in my master's, that if you're obese, but you have all your fat stored in your hips and your butt, you're likely to be very healthy. Whereas if you store all your fat in the beer gut, that we were talking about earlier, then you're very likely to be unhealthy if you have that apple body shape. And so even if you have the identical body weight, and so that's one of the reasons why women tend to be healthier than men for a given weight, because they tend to store their weight more in their lower body where it's safe, as opposed to up here where it does all sorts of damage. So BMI completely ignores these differences, which is a big problem. And then finally, the big problem is that BMI is completely resistant to change. So a lot of people will exercise, they'll see improvements in health, their insulin sensitivity gets better, their waist circumference comes down, but they don't lose weight, so they think it's not working, so they quit. And that's a big problem with BMI, because your body weight doesn't tend to change, especially once it goes up. It tends to never come down. It only tends to go up really over the long term. So it's really tough to change with interventions, and I think that's a big problem. So as a result of these problems with BMI, it's been suggested that there may be a new way to assess obesity. We have it now in adults, and they're adopting this for kids. And this focuses more on health rather than body weight. So this is the Edmonton Obesity Staging System. And so the stage 0 obese would be someone who's obese but who has no health risk. So yes, they have a lot of body weight, but their health is fine. So this is someone that you would really only just make sure they have a healthy lifestyle. If not, you might help promote a healthy lifestyle, but you really wouldn't worry about their weight because there doesn't seem to be a health impact. Stage 1 would be someone who has a bit of a health risk, high blood sugar, high blood pressure, but still, they don't have a full-on chronic disease. Stage 2 obesity would be someone who has an established chronic disease like diabetes. Stage 3 has really significant end organ damage, and Stage 4 is someone who may be nearing a loss of life or significant disability based on their body size. And so what this is arguing is that we should focus on these people who are unhealthy, and these people who are up here, which is most kids with obesity especially, we should focus on just promoting healthy behaviors, preventing further weight gain, and really not worrying so much about their body weight as much as we have in the past. Okay, so now in the last section, I'd like to talk about what should we do then for kids or anyone who has overweight or obesity. So is childhood obesity a parental or societal responsibility? How many people here would say that it's more a parental responsibility? You guys have a few hands. How many people would say it's more of a societal responsibility? Okay, so sort of an even split. Both are important. It would be better if we made societal changes that made it easier for parents, but I think obviously parents do have a lot of control there. So I think that was very well put. And I don't really have an answer for that, and I don't know if anyone has a better answer than the one you just provided. So here are sort of my tips for ways we can promote healthy living for kids, whether or not they're overweight or obese. So like was mentioned, I think we should really try to minimize screen time, which I know is tough. There are some devices you can buy, like I said, that will limit screen time, so kids have to put in a code every day, and once they reach their limit, the TV shuts off. Yeah?
Or just hide the charger to the iPad.
That's an excellent... That's fantastic, because that's what I've heard.
They don't get it, so they say.
That's fantastic, because I've heard a lot of people say that the problem is that it's a lot of parental conflict with the kids, and that's why these boxes are good, because then it's not the parental conflict. But that's a really sneaky way to do it. I like that. Yeah. That's good. Yeah, Kathy?
I used to tell my kids to go on their iPhone and check out the website Saltometer, so that all the salt that they would be consuming.
Okay.
And then young kids with high blood pressure, because of the salt,
Yeah.
they made them more aware of foods containing the high salt.
Right, so using screen time for positive things at least. Right.
Things for stroke on
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And so again, just sort of basic things we already talked about for all of these. And if you are going to use screen time, then I guess if you can steer it towards productive things at least, that would probably be good. I think a really, really important one that often gets missed is that we should focus on all kids. So a lot of the time, parents, schools, governments, they focus on the kids who are obese because it's very visible if a kid is obese or not. But then, if you're a skinny kid that has all these unhealthy behaviors, you're going to be unhealthy. You're still at increased risk for all these things. And as was mentioned before, there's a lot of stigma and bias around childhood obesity. People don't treat obese people well. Doctors tend to miss other health issues because they just say, oh, well, it's related to the obesity. You should just eat less, move more. So we really need to focus on promoting these healthy behaviors for all kids rather than just the obese. Yes?
Sorry, one of the things that I don't know if you but cultural, food and culture. I mean, my culture, I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
The 8-year-old, my mom's like, she doesn't eat it if she's too
Right.
sick. It's this forcing, like chasing her around the room. If she doesn't want it, she doesn't want it.
Right.
So a lot of this is also, culture.
Yes.
And sort of that belief that,
Oh, absolutely.
every event is like food is the main
Right.
right?
Yes, well, and actually, so Yoni, this physician in Ottawa, has a feature on his website where he features day camps and schools and all these situations where people give kids junk food, and it's just a one-time thing, but they all add up, and so he's started featuring ones that have changed and now have healthy foods because, like you say, it's everywhere, and I don't have good answers for especially for parenting because I'm not a parent. But I know things like eat all the food on your plate and those sorts of things. It's not necessarily good messages anymore, but it's tough to know what is the appropriate message. And maybe someone here knows more than I do on that. Yes. Right. Exactly. And people often reward kids with food. So I know Megan and I were talking about that last night. That often if kids do something well, then you give them a candy, or they punish kids with physical activity, which is also bad.
Or you say, if you finish your meal, then you can have dessert.
Yeah, no, exactly, yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. But there is good evidence that if you do sort of a different thing, if you say you can watch TV, but only if you do an hour of physical activity, there's some evidence that not only cuts down on screen time, it improves physical activity. So that sort of thing can work well. So instead of using food as a positive, maybe consider using other things. And again, as I've been saying, focus on behaviors rather than body weight. I really can't emphasize that enough. And if you're concerned about a child's health, so if they're, not just if they're overweight, but they're overweight and they seem to have health issues related to being overweight, then I'd urge you to try and get in touch with a physician who focuses on childhood obesity, which is very rare. There aren't many doctors who know much about obesity, unfortunately. They don't get a lot of training in obesity at the moment, so doctors aren't always prepared for obesity in general, especially in kids. But there is a new program at Sick Kids. There's a program in Ottawa where it's focused just on childhood obesity, and they're doing well. So if you are concerned, then I'd urge you to look into the program at Sick Kids or CHIO, because they're probably your best bet. And I would just reiterate that when it comes to obesity, an ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure, because as I mentioned, once you're overweight or obese, as many people know, you're never going to come back down to a normal body weight, or it's very rare that someone can do that and keep it off. So you can definitely be healthy, you're just going to be healthier at a higher body weight. But it's relatively easier to prevent weight gain. So if kids are engaging in these healthy behaviors, they may not lose weight, but it may prevent them from gaining more weight. So just some policy implications, and again, these are sort of my ideas, so they may or may not be good ones, but they're ones that I think would make sense. A big one is I think we should ban advertisements targeting children. Quebec has already done this. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you like that. Quebec has already done this, at least nominally, although I don't think they really enforce it. Sort of a related one would be consider a sugar tax, which has been getting a lot of attention in the news. Not a fat tax, but a sugar tax. And I think it makes sense. Some evidence suggests that it might reduce consumption. So I think it would make sense to do that. I also think it would make sense to remove high-calorie beverages from schools. And as you were mentioning before, I don't think it would necessarily be good. In high school, if you took out all the pop, I would have just drank way more Fruitopia and thought it was healthy because, it's fruit. And so I think it would make sense to also take out or limit juice as well, because if you just replace all your pop with juice, it's probably going to have bad impact as well. Another one that sort of we haven't talked about much today, but I think one that would make sense would be to help people either understand or follow the food guide. I know the dietitians in the audience may disagree with me here or may not, but I know my colleague Jen Cook at York has done some research suggesting that people think they need to consume 200 or 300 extra calories a day to meet the food guide. So most people interpret it that they need to eat more to meet the food guide. And so I think either changing the food guide or helping people to understand it more would probably be good, since we don't need to be promoting, increased food intake for most people. We need to maybe be changing the foods they are consuming or eating a bit less. I think it would make sense to maybe delay school start times. I know parents and teachers may not like this. My wife's a teacher, she would love this, but I know a lot of teachers wouldn't. But again, if kids are going to bed later, if school started a bit later, it would probably help. And then this one comes a bit out of left field in this presentation, but as I was saying, things like active transportation and motor skills, they seem like they're definitely important for physical activity, whether or not they're important for weight. And I think since we're trying to promote health rather than just weight, we should really try to improve these behaviors, have motor skill development in schools and improve active transportation, allow kids to bike to school. My lab mate actually went to school in Kingston. He had to hide his bike in a ditch because they weren't allowed to bike to school. So he was like, yeah, it was insane. But so we need to sort of change those policies and encourage them, whether or not they're going to prevent obesity, but just because they're good behaviors. So just to finish up by revisiting my learning outcomes. So hopefully now you're all able to describe how we define childhood obesity. It's using BMI and those growth curves. Hopefully now you can identify key contributors to the childhood obesity epidemic. So the big four, at least, that we can be certain about are increased sugar sweetened beverage intake, screen time, sleep, and parental obesity. And obviously those first three are the ones we can actually really kind of target. And then hopefully you can recognize ways to adopt or encourage healthy lifestyles. So all the things you know are healthy are still very healthy, and focus on those rather than necessarily focusing so much on weight. And I would urge you especially not to have weight as an outcome. So don't, I know families that gave their daughter a leather jacket for meeting a weight loss goal as a teenager, and things like that aren't good for a lot of reasons. So really don't focus on weight as an outcome. Focus on those healthy behaviors. So I'd like to just briefly acknowledge this is my research group in Ottawa. We play road hockey 3 to 4 times a week on our lunch hours. And so I'd like to thank my supervisor, Mark Tremblay, who's phenomenal and who encourages us heavily with our road hockey. And if you're ever there, we have lots of extra sticks. If you're interested in childhood obesity research, this is our lab website, so haloresearch.ca, we're the Halo Research Group. So we put up 3 or 4 posts a week, all of our publications, our talks and stuff. So if you're interested in stuff, it's a great website to go and sign up for the RSS feed there. This is my personal website. The title is ironic. There is no cure for obesity, so obesity panacea. So if you're interested in sedentary behavior especially, I post a lot of articles and things on my research there. And finally, if you're interested specifically in sedentary behavior, we now have a sedentary behavior research network, which is free to join, called SBURN. So you can sign up for free at sedentarybehavior.org. We've got all sorts of studies on sedentary behavior all in a big database there. So it's a nice little resource if you're interested in that. And I believe that's it. So if there's any more discussion or questions, I'm happy to take those now.